We are now live. Welcome, everybody. As I mentioned, people will be moving kind of over and then we can chat. I know Lindsay Toms, our other owner here, is in the background moderating, and so she'll share some links and other things. Um, and Kelly Tice is on. Hi, Kelly. Hi, Emily. Hi,
Hey,
everyone.
Kelly.
If you guys, if you guys wanted to say hello, good morning. If you can hear us, it usually takes a second to come into the chat. We're so happy to see everyone already joining. Hi, Veronica. Always so good to see you. Hi, Kelly, Emily, a lot of the folks that, Julian, a lot of the folks that we know from the Study Pro, Christine Woodward. It's so nice to see everybody. Oh, hi, Jen Rossman. How are you?
I'm trying to find my keyboard here.
Hi, Jill in Warrington. That's good to hear, everybody. Hi, Sylvia. Kelly, Christine, the other Kelly. We have about 3 minutes and we're going to let people join. There was a super popular topic. I started to tell you, Dr. Resnik, when we were speaking last time, that, I watched and quoted the last time that you gave this, at least that you have the one you have online. And I'm so excited to see the updated research because I find this topic so fascinating, both from a personal perspective as well as a professional one, because I know that, a lot of parents ask questions about motivation. Is it in our context, are they like not doing their homework because they're not motivated, or is it because they, there's other issues like executive function? So I know we're going to dive into that today. And I think everybody's going to be super interested in all of the research that you bring to the table. And I love the fact that it allows us to, really see the science behind really, as it says, the science behind motivation. And it's not just that our kids don't care. There's a lot of things they really want to do, but it's just there's barriers that get in the way. So we will give it till about 9 o'clock. So we have 2 more minutes and welcoming everybody. And so we're all glad that you're here.
Somebody from London.
I know. Hi, Kartik. How are you? We've had people all over the globe join our webinar, so we're super excited about that. And Hampton, Virginia, Warrington. So glad to see everyone here. I wish I could hear some of the folks live because I'd love that British accent to add a little add a little interest to our American accents here.
Yeah, I have that lovely Maryland accent, which nobody thinks is beautiful.
I think I don't know if Ohio has an accent. I'm originally from Ohio, so I don't know how much that is, but I think that's oh wow, another from Kent, England. Hi, Anthony. How are you? That's fantastic. You're very popular, Dr. Resnick. Where the topic is. All right, so it's 9 o'clock, and I know people are still joining, but I'm going to go ahead and get started just because I know we're excited about the topic here. And so I will more formally welcome you, Dr. Resnick, but we're certainly thrilled that you're here and agreed to do this. But for some people who don't know much about the Study Pro, my name is Debbie Rosen. I'm the founder and co-owner, and Lindsay Toms is in the background waving to you virtually, and just making sure that the links and everything are provided as people are interested in things. But we are an executive function and study skills center. And so, of course, that means that we focus on the process side of school, all the things that you see here on the right. And it is such a tie to the concept of motivation as we were talking about it. So we're interested in sharing more about that today. There's a number of things that we do to help build executive functions and the strategies to overcome some of the barriers we were talking about on the previous slide. And you can see some of those things here. We're excited about a lot of the free things that we do, such as these webinars every month. We have one more workshop that's free, another writing workshop for 4th and 5th graders, and that's going to happen actually Saturday in this space right here. So if you are local, sorry for the people in London, then we'd love for you to come. Hopefully you can see this QR code if you're interested in that, if you have a 4th and 5th grader. And if not, there's information on our website under our programs tab. There's something called workshops, and you'll find it there. And then we also, next month, very soon actually, in a couple weeks, have Rachel Bailey, who has spoken here before, and a somewhat related topic in terms of how to help children build self-esteem. And she's an excellent presenter if you haven't heard her before. So I have another QR code, and we're sending that invitation. If you're here today, you will definitely get that invitation. It's going out tomorrow for the first time, so you can expect to see that in your inboxes. And then finally, we're very excited about summer. We have a lot of new services that we're offering. So this summer, we're actually offering math coaching to help keep with those math packets, parent coaching from an executive function perspective. And we're also offering our study skills course, writing course, and some other things. So you can look on our website for that, as well as there's a PDF you can download. And finally, the part that everyone's waiting for, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Resnik. First time ever here, and we hope that won't be the last. And I wanted to share a little bit about you, which is over the course of the conversations we've had, I've been very excited. You and I have a parallel passion in entrepreneurship and growing our businesses. And you are, of course, the founder of Rebecca Resnik and Associates, which is a 28-person group. Not only do you provide psychological testing and psychotherapy, but also educational consulting and, of course, the public speaking. I was talking to Dr. Resnik, and on top of being the president of the Maryland Psychological Association, you have so many accolades to your name, and I'm so impressed with not only the research that you do and you'll share with us today, but how you contribute to the community with all the talks that you give. And the willingness for you to do this today, we're very, very grateful. And so I'm going to stop sharing my slides and allow you to share your slides and turn things over more formally to you. While you're doing that, we did put the links in the chat if anybody needs those. So we're very excited to have you today. And while you're presenting, I will actually put myself on mute. And I'm here the whole time. So if there's anything that I can do for you, please let me know. So welcome.
Okay, thanks. Hi, everybody. Welcome. So pleased to be here. Happy April. And I love this topic. This is one that I don't get to talk about as much as I actually like to, because once the pandemic hit, everybody wanted like anxiety and stress and anxiety all the time. So hopefully now that we're in this past pandemic era, we can start talking about really important things again that aren't just about how the world is falling apart. So for the first part, we need to kind of reframe the conversation. A lot of you are probably here because of very specific, concrete things that you are bothered by or troubled by or worried about in your kids. And we need to reframe the conversation away from the things that people are complaining about our kids and get to a more meta level. So typically when someone comes to see someone like me or Debbie, they're talking about their kid in terms of like really pejorative language, lazy, unmotivated, don't care. A lot of kids have screen problems. I have, 2 kids still at home, and we are living through the pandemic. My kids were in school during the pandemic, and I am right there with you, looking at the pernicious impact that screens had on our kids and are still having. Kids are described as stubborn or not listening, or as if they're sort of making choices volitionally not to be successful. And you hear this a lot, especially from teachers. And so let's reframe our conversation when we're thinking about motivation as not something that is all about the child. Because if something's all about this child has a problem, a disability, they're willful or stubborn, what have you, that really shuts down the adult's thinking. It's like blaming a patient in a hospital for not getting better. So let's go from criticism to actually useful questions. And a question is useful when it leads us towards an action plan. I'm all about action plans. That's my job, is to figure out what's happening with a kid when I see them for neuropsychological testing. The question is not just describe this child, but please give us a plan for what we can actually do and connect us up with the people who can help, like folks at StudyPro, for one of the great examples in our community. So more useful questions are things like, how can we teach a child to push through frustration? How can we teach a child to motivate himself or herself or themselves so that we don't have to be on them all the time? How do we develop those skills that they need to be successful? And how do we foster the child's belief that they can actually achieve and set goals and attain them? So, framing our discussion today, this is the core message. If you take nothing else away from this talk, it is, I think, this Rick Lavoie quote, Dr. Rick Lavoie, famous educator, is very powerful. And it says, people often say that if he would only try harder, he would succeed. This is backwards. If he could only succeed, he would try harder. So let's keep that idea in the back of our minds when we're thinking about how do we motivate kids. Nothing breeds success like tasting success, like that sense that anything is possible, that goals are attainable. I want to couch motivation problems in terms of executive functioning problems. So I practice neuropsychology, and what that is a very important sounding way of saying that I pay a lot of attention to the underlying neuroscience and neuropsychological processes that underlie problems where kids are getting stuck or not achieving up to their potential. When I think about executive functioning problems, I'm thinking about a kid's brain and how brains develop and how people learn. And a motivation problem is a brain based executive functioning problem. And I'm going to go through some of the neuroscience, not too much so that you'll be like, picking up your iPhone and checking Instagram. But I really do want to couch these in terms of the neurobiology and the developmental process. So things like problems with attentional control, self-regulation of mood and behavior, the ability to break down tasks into manageable parts instead of just, avoiding them or freaking out. Planning. This is a really important executive functioning task that is central to motivation. If we can't plan how to attack a problem, where's our motivation? And of course, working strategically. A lot of the kids that I see are working harder, not smarter. They're throwing in a whole bunch of effort. They're diving into the deep end of the pool, treading water until they get exhausted and then sinking under instead of making it all the way to the other side. This is Dr. Sam Goldstein, and he is the editor of the Journal of Attention Disorders. If you ever get the chance to see him speak, my understanding is that CHAD conference is going to be in Baltimore next year. He may be there. Fantastic speaker. And the way he describes the executive functioning problems that get in the way for a lot of our kids is that our kids have problems with start, stop, and finish. They don't start the things they need to start. They don't stop doing the things they need to stop, like being on their phone or dilly-dallying or playing video games. And they don't finish. A lot of these kids have very good intentions. I am going to make up all 6 of those missed assignments. And they start out well and they get blocked or tired or frustrated or exhausted, and then they don't finish. So remember, start, stop, and finish. These are our sources of problems. This is what gets in the way of motivation. Our trick in terms of improving motivation is to give these kids the tools so that they can be consistent, so that they'll do, the same thing every time without adult support, so that they're predictable. We know that if they have a task in front of them, that they will probably be successful and independent. This is the hokey pokey of parenting. That's what it's all about, is making it so that our kids no longer need us. So we want to go from problems with start, stop, and finish to consistent, predictable, and independent. If you were in school in the 1990s, as I was, I got my master's degree in 96. That's how old I am. We learned that brains were like computers. And what we know now that people are actually really able to study human brains using technology like fMRI is that brains are not at all like computers. Brains program themselves. And the way that a brain adapts to a wonderfully complicated social environment and problem solving environment is they program themselves in response to things that they experience. If you think about all the time that our kids spent during the pandemic alone in their rooms with nothing but a computer screen and probably like way too many junk food wrappers laying around them, this was not a good source of information and programming for our kids' brains. We are having to undo a lot of the programming from all those missed opportunities during the pandemic. Who programs the human brain? It is parents, it is teachers, it is grandparents, mentors, coaches, tutors, all of these social experiences that we give to our children. It takes a village to raise a child, famous sort of adage, but this is literally true because the child's interactions with important people in their lives, these program their brain and they are the most powerful motivator. If you think about it, people will do a lot for rewards, but people will do anything for social relationships. I mean, for good and for bad, and you think about soldiers marching into battle, ready to die for their comrades. That's not because they were getting paid a lot. It's because they cared about their buddies or they cared about a cause. When we're looking at kids who have motivation problems, there's often relationship problems, relationships that need to be strengthened or fixed, or maybe they need new relationships to help them untap that motivation. Now we're getting a little into the neuroscience, but I'm going to try to make it fun and try to make it bite-sized so that it will stick. So goals exist within a hierarchy. You can't do everything all at once. If you are, a middle-aged woman like I am with a business to run, you constantly have a lot of things that you need to take care of. Everything from parenting to paying your taxes to elder care. Oh my gosh. So goals exist within a hierarchy. How do we set the priority? How do we decide whether today I'm going to pay my taxes or give my son a driving lesson? It's our emotions. Our emotions set the priorities. When your child is making a choice to, say, play on their video game instead of doing the homework packet that they're supposed to do, it is not the logic that is really responsible for that unwise decision. It is their emotional response. So we can't pursue all of our goals at once. Brains don't just prioritize pleasure. We don't do everything that just feels good in the moment. If we did, none of us would be like up and dressed for work. And the people in London certainly wouldn't be on attending a webinar all the way in the United States. We are much more about setting goals around relationships than we are around setting goals around pleasure. So goal attainment, actually accomplishing things, depends a lot on our ever maturing ability to inhibit our impulses, to delay gratification. Human beings are capable of delaying gratification for years and even decades. If you think about how long it takes us like to become a psychologist, that can be like an 8 to 10 year process. For a physician, same thing. You want to have a happy marriage, you're basically setting a goal for yourself for the rest of your entire life. And a lot of achieving your goals is not just what you do, but what you don't do. And again, it is emotions that are the rudder that steers this ship. Okay, so now we're getting into brain stuff. And you may have heard a lot about the neuromodulator dopamine, and neuromodulators are just one of the chemical signaling processes that happen in not just our brain, but all through our body. So a neurotransmitter is when a chemical is sending messages in your brain, but those same chemicals are present talking to all the glands and fat cells and ovaries and your heart, all the systems throughout your body. These same chemicals are there sending messages. And one of the neuromodulators we often associate with motivation is dopamine, because dopamine, epinephrine, and endorphins have a lot to do with how much we can get ourselves up and going and moving and taking action. Now, dopamine does a lot of different things in the brain. But we're really thinking of that mesolimbic dopamine stream, where you have dopamine flowing up from the more emotional parts of your brain, the parts that get us through threatening situations, activate like our fight, flight, or freeze, give us a lot of pleasure. That flow of messaging comes all the way up, and dopamine and epinephrine are sending chemical signals all the way up through the sort of judgment part of our brain, this wise part that tells us when to put the brakes on and don't do something, or to delay some pleasure in service of achieving a greater goal. And endorphins are really just about pleasure. People often say like, oh, dopamine, that's the pleasure neurotransmitter. It's not really. Dopamine is our get up and go neurotransmitter. Dopamine is really the thing that motivates us to take action. Now, young brains are programmed to learn and do new things. This is why teenagers go out and do nutty and dumb stuff, and why they, dye their hair weird colors and get piercings in all sorts of fun places. And you maybe drive carelessly, or send inappropriate pictures on their cell phones. That is a brain that is doing exactly what it's supposed to do, which is try new things. Teenagers are programmed for it. They seek out novelty. Now, seeking out novelty and doing all of those things when you're trying to raise your kids when you are older, that's obviously not a good thing. Parents who are still like out there doing crazy stuff like adolescents are probably not very successful parents. So the thing to keep in mind is that for younger people, they have a lot of motivation. They do a lot of cool stuff, but context can impact how much of a dopamine response they have, how much they can really experience that wave of get up and go. Now, here's the problem, of course, is that we have a brain that was designed for surviving thousands of years ago in sort of the hunter gatherer and ice age era of our planet's history. And now we take this ancient brain and smack, it's trying to function in modern life. So remember, dopamine is that get up and go neuromodulator. It's the thing that spurs us to action. Well, what we have in our modern life are things that are so exciting to our brain that set off so much of what we call a dopamine spike that it becomes a problem for us. And I think we all can think of things in modern life that give us like a serious rush of pleasure and excitement. Unfortunately, that's things like video games, drugs, super processed junk food, binge watching TV, cell phones. And these things don't just work on teenagers. Of course, they work on us. Most of the problems that teenagers are having with technology, adults are having just as much problems. But for some reason, we blame the kids as if this generation is somehow like faulty when we're the ones who gave them the technology in the first place. So modern life jacks up our dopamine spikes. Now, on the one hand, that feels great. The problem is brains are just like anything else. When you use a lot of a resource, you run out of it and you have to make more. So dopamine's kind of like a seesaw in the brain. When you have dopamine levels spiking up really high, like let's say you're right at the last level of a video game and you're about to finish the whole thing and it's super exciting, you got a big old dopamine spike. Well, here's the problem. After the spike comes the trough. It's just like any other wave at the beach. And so after your brain uses a whole bunch, the dopamine levels actually dip down below baseline. If you've had the experience of your kids being super grumpy when you get them off of a video game or tell them to put their phone away, this is why. It's not a character flaw in them. It's because their brain is in the middle of a dopamine trough and they're feeling pretty yucky and probably grumpy and irritable, and certainly not in a headspace where they're likely to have a lot of dopamine left to carry them through that next wave of getting homework done. No, young brains are very plastic. Remember, I said that brains are computers that program themselves. Young brains, most of all, teenagers are in a major overhaul of their brain and they are pruning neurons right, left. They are making new connections. That brain is becoming leaner and meaner and more efficient. So, this process of plasticity unfolds. It starts up right around age 11 and 12. And this is when kids start to get stinky feet and they get kind of moody and sweaty and hairy and all those fun things. But they also become really interesting people to talk to. So brains rewire in response to these really high dopamine spikes and troughs. So after we experience a dopamine spike from something really pleasurable, like say food or cocaine or a video game or being on our phone, after that spike comes the trough. And so over time, what happens is that our brains adjust to expecting there to be really high rushes of dopamine, and we start to seek that out. And we don't get as much of a bump from things like, say reading a good book or the satisfaction of finishing a homework assignment or cleaning our room. These are sort of low dopamine activities that don't give us that super high rush. And so part of the problem for our pandemic kids is that they got hooked on things during the pandemic that gave them those big spikes and those big rushes. And now we have to get them back into the world of experiencing pleasure from things that don't cause that super intense, dramatic response right away. So, what actually sparks motivation? Now we're going out of neuroscience and we're talking about the context. How is that brain functioning in an environment? And these are the things that we can actually do something about. So, the first part, of course, is, what sparks motivation? Well, you get motivated when there's a reward to get, obviously, no great revelation there. And of course, we also are very motivated to escape discomfort. If a mosquito is biting me, I am very motivated to smack that mosquito so to end that discomfort. But the problem is that when we as adults try to change our kids' behavior just by pulling the levers of rewards and consequences, we're not really teaching our kids anything. Rewards work fine for a while. But the problem is, once a behavior, something like practicing the piano, to cite a pretty well known research study, once a behavior is explicitly tied to a reward, I do this behavior, I practice my piano for 30 minutes, I get a reward. Once a behavior is tied to an expected reward, it's very hard then for somebody to intrinsically motivate themselves to do it because they're so focused on behavior equals reward. Punishment and consequences used very judiciously and occasionally can sometimes change behavior, but what they more often do is make kids aggressive and angry and frustrated. So we have better alternatives. It's not that we're not going to hold kids accountable. We definitely want to hold kids accountable, or else how can they, hold a job or get married or, achieve their goals? But just the levers of reward and punishment, as you often see teachers using with like their behavior modification systems, this is a good place to start, but it's a terrible place to finish. The other things that spark motivation are novelty and play. And if you've been a teacher, as I have, you know that as soon as you go from lecturing to playing a game, this is when everybody gets a dopamine rush and everybody's excited and much more engaged. Remember, young brains are designed to seek out novelty. They're designed to play. And what does school do is pretty much take away all the novelty and all the play. And then somehow we expect kids to be motivated. That's just not how brains work. I already talked about the importance of relationships, and we are going to talk more in the last part of this conversation. Well, it's a one-sided conversation. I'm talking, you're not, unfortunately, until the end. We have self-efficacy, when skills match demands, and a sense of control. And now we're moving into talking about those things. I want to teach you some important concepts so that you can think more objectively and mindfully about motivation problems that you're seeing in your kid. So as I go through these, I want you to think about some examples like, oh, okay, that's why my kid does X, or that's why my kid doesn't do Y. Now, why do I have a picture of Inigo Montoya from The Princess Bride up here? Because Inigo Montoya is one of the best examples of the concept of emotional salience that I've ever come across. If you have read The Princess Bride or seen the movie, you know that Inigo Montoya's father was brutally murdered in front of him by a six-fingered man with a sword. And Inigo Montoya's response to this was to become very, very motivated. He was motivated by revenge, and he devotes his life to the study of the sword. Would he have been that motivated to study the sword had his father not been brutally murdered in front of him? Probably not. But because it became so emotionally salient to get revenge on his father's killer, that this drove decades of motivation on his part. So when we have salience, when we have that drive to achieve something, when it becomes emotionally important to us and we really, really care, this is when we get motivated. Think about how few things we ask our kids to do during the course of a school day actually really bring on much emotional salience for them. It's kind of depressing how little we teach kids that they feel really any kind of emotional connection to it all. Here's how we increase motivation to learn. There's two concepts here, and they're laid out in this matrix. So we have things that make sense and things that are salient. Remember, salience is what we care about. Now, things can be salient and they can make sense in high or low levels. So let me pull your attention up to the left-hand grid where we have things that have little salience. We don't care much about them, but they make sense. They're easy to understand. This is when we get moderate motivation. So things like when you are on an airplane and the flight attendant goes through that whole safety drill. Because the plane is not actually crashing at that moment, you're just sitting there on the tarmac, getting your books ready, getting your snacks ready. You're probably tired and cranky. That really is easy to understand, but it doesn't have a lot of salience for you. It really doesn't have a lot of salience for you until you hit that point where you're like, oh, I wonder if something's wrong. Now let's look down at the one that says It's got little salience, but it doesn't make sense. That lower left-hand corner. For a lot of our kids, especially our teenagers taking classes that they really don't find the slightest bit interesting and they don't understand why they're useful, they're spending a lot of their day in this lower left-hand corner where things have little salience to them. For me, it was Algebra 2. I could have cared less about Algebra 2 and I hated having to take it. And it doesn't make sense. This is kind of kiss of death for our motivation. So as you think through your kid's school day, where is your kid hitting this lower left-hand quadrant where things have little salience and they don't make sense? These are things like if you were on a subway and you heard some people speaking in a language that you don't speak, it would have little salience and it wouldn't make sense. I'm sure a lot of us took classes like me in Algebra 2. Poor Miss Crozier had to deal with me, just totally checked out. And what do? We check out, just like I said. When things have little salience and they don't make sense, this is the hardest place to get motivated. Now, if we look on the right-hand side, in that upper right-hand quadrant, when things have high salience, they matter to us and they make sense, this is where we're motivated and we're learning and we're achieving goals. So the more we can change our child's environment to have high salience and things make sense, this is when we unlock their motivation. This is that sweet spot. Now, the lower right-hand corner is also a problem. When things are really matter to us, we care about them, but they don't make sense. So for a lot of our kids with learning disabilities and ADHD and executive functioning problems and neurodivergence and autism, they want so badly to do well. They want to make their teachers proud, their parents proud, their coaches proud. Things have a lot of salience, but they don't make sense. And so a lot of these kids are in this lower right-hand quadrant where school is so stressful. They want to do better, but they just can't figure out how. And this is where tutoring and psychology and mental health and executive functioning coaches, this is where we can really help those kids. Now, what douses and blocks motivation? Stress, anxiety, and depression are often the culprits. Again, we blame kids as if kids are making conscious choices when they don't do homework or they spend too much time on their phone. A lot of times, this is a symptom, not the problem in and of itself, not a character flaw, but you're seeing kids who are stressed, anxious, and depressed. The important thing to remember that mental health practitioners know is that kids can look like they're fine, but on the inside be really anxious or really depressed. That disconnection from others. I hear this a lot when kids go to really large schools and they feel like nobody cares about them. Their teachers don't even know who they are. They don't have a lot of friends. I once tested a kid who had stopped going to school for 30 days and nobody ever noticed. So was his motivation doused by the sense that nobody cared about him? Absolutely. And then what we're going to hit in the last part is these lagging and lacking skills. And I took this language from Ross Green to credit him. A lot of our kids, again, they're in that lower right-hand quadrant where they have high salience, but things don't make sense. This is when the context doesn't match what the kid is capable of. And of course, healthy brain and healthy body go together. When we have poor physical health and sleep problems, we can't be motivated as well as we should. And then, of course, all of these can come together to give us distorted beliefs where we don't really believe that making an effort makes a difference. Here's a quote from neuroscientist Mary Helen Immordino Yang that I really like. It is literally neurobiologically impossible to think deeply about things that you don't care about. When things have low emotional salience for you, for me, pretty much reading any legal document that I have to read as part of being a business owner, when you really don't care about what it is you're reading and it doesn't hit that emotional salience dopamine spike for you, we can tell our kids work harder, try harder, work harder, try harder until we are blue in the face and nothing really changes until we find some way to make this task matter to the kid or make it matter that somebody else cares about their success with the task. Here's another key word I want to give you. So the first one was the first one was emotional salience. The second one that's a really useful term is limbic friction. Limbic friction refers to basically how hard you have to work to make yourself do it. And if you're a dog lover like me, you know that this dog is not happy right now because the dog is obviously not eating the treat in order to please its owner or trainer, but it really wants that treat. So this is an example of limbic friction where you are inhibiting yourself, where you really want to be doing something else, anything else, and yet you have to exert a lot of effortful control to push through a frustrating or tedious or low emotional salience type of task. And for me, that was algebra 2. I had to really, really force myself to study, and I could put in a lot of time. But because there was so much limbic friction there, I was often much more focused on how annoyed I was or how frustrated or how, I felt like I really wanted to like rebel against this class, but I couldn't because I wanted to get into college. So limbic friction takes work. And the more limbic friction that is at play when a young person is trying to do a task, the tireder they get. Remember, your dopamine reserves and your norepinephrine reserves, they run out. Your brain needs time to go back and make more of them. So this is why things like cramming for periods of time over an hour, they really don't work. They have diminished returns. Why? Because your brain literally runs out of its supply of neurotransmitters that allow you to learn, and you get tired and cranky. And then you can put in more time, but you have diminished returns. So the higher the level of limbic friction, the more effort and the lower payoff you tend to get out of telling a kid, work harder, push through, stay focused longer. Okay. So we had emotional salience, limbic friction, and now we're up to cognitive load. Cognitive load is thinking about how much work your brain has to do a particular task. What are the attention and working memory demands of that task? Now, I put the cat in the hat up there because obviously he's juggling a whole bunch of stuff. So, your mental image of cognitive load can be the cat in the hat juggling a whole bunch of things. So, how much conscious attention is required? The cognitive load of, say, first and second grade is much lower than the cognitive load of the tasks after third grade. We go from tasks that can be completed very quickly to tasks like writing a report, doing a multi-step math problem, reading a chapter book. The higher you get in terms of the educational level, the higher the cognitive load. So you go from writing words to sentences to essays to reports to term papers. The cognitive load gets bigger all the time. This is where our executive functioning coaches come in, and our assistive technology specialists come in, and our professional educators and tutors, because they can figure out how to reduce the cognitive load of any given task. When it exceeds what the student can manage, again, you get a lot of limbic friction, and the emotional salience tends to go down as the kid gets more tired and frustrated. This is often when professional educators and coaches and ADHD specialists can help. Motivation's not enough. If you remember, I gave you a teaser about how we must consider the context. Remember, the kids try harder the more success they experience. Success builds on success. And there's a wonderful Trevor Noah quote. People love to say, give a man a fish and he'll eat for a day, teach a man to fish and he'll eat for a lifetime. But what they don't say is, and it would be great if you gave him a fishing rod. That's the part of the analogy that's missing. Now, he was talking about people who had survived apartheid in South Africa. But this quote applies just as much to our kids. Telling our kids work harder, punishing them, offering them rewards and bribes, it doesn't matter in the slightest unless the child has the tools that they need to be successful. Now, for those of you who know me, I am like 5'2" and very stubby, and I am not fast or very coordinated. So if you said to me, Rebecca, I'm going to give you $1 million if you can sink a 3-point shot on this basketball court, I would be very motivated. But is that ever going to happen? No, you can be sure. I can be as motivated until the cows come home, and I will never have the skills or the talent or the ability I would need to sink a 3-point shot. So we're often setting our kids up for failure when we're pushing them to do things, but we don't give them the tools. And again, this is where psych testing and tutoring and executive functioning coaching, this is where we give the kid the fishing rod. Kids get flooded when there's too much stress. And when I talk about being flooded, I literally mean that the brain and body are flooded with glucocorticoids, with stress hormones. So when you see your kid kind of wanting to do well, but getting too exhausted or starting to complain or disengage, it is probably a physiological process where the context is too much for the skill set that they bring to the table. And of course, if you've studied the Yerkes-Dodson law, all of you psychologists out there, too much stress overwhelms the system. And this is where we get kids disengaging and making unwise choices and maybe even behaving in some very uncooperative or unattractive or oppositional ways when we're asking them to do schoolwork. When kids are showing us through uncooperative or negative behavior, that they are frustrated, this is something to pay attention to, because what it often means is they lack the skills to rise to the occasion and succeed in what we're asking them to do. Importantly, we don't see things as they are, we see them as we are. If you remember, one of the last items on that grid I showed you was all about that sense of self-efficacy, the belief that you can actually set a goal and you have what you need to achieve it. We don't see these things as they are, we see them as we are. Now I have a picture up here of my kids. They're both watching my neighbor do a magic trick, and you can see the older kid understands that it's just a trick. The younger one thought that my neighbor had just broken a glass vase. Remember, we don't see things as they are. We see them according to what we believe in our knowledge base for understanding the situation. So to an adult, the problems that our kids have getting their homework done, organizing their books, taking tests, we've dealt with these, some of us for almost 5 decades. We see things as being pretty simple. Why can't you just do your homework? Why can't you just study? But the problem is, for our kids, from their perspective, these can seem absolutely overwhelming, as looking down a tidal wave and trying to figure out how you're going to surf. So again, what douses motivation? Pretty much everything that we ask our kids to do in your typical one size fits all K through 12 classroom. I do want to bring up one really important thing that is often overlooked in this conversation, but is absolutely critical to having a brain that functions well, a brain that can overcome limbic friction, a brain that is not just relying on dopamine spikes, and a brain that can really learn. We have to have a healthy body. And Deborah and I were talking before this about how we managed to drag our middle-aged bodies out to work out in spite of having had a lot of injuries. For our kids, exercise and movement breaks is really critical. The more that kids exercise, if our kids could be doing an hour's worth of cardiovascular exercise every single day, we could probably eliminate the need for a lot of kids who are on medication, and a lot of kids who are having behavior problems, and a lot of kids who need psychotherapy. We know that exercise is the most powerful thing we can do to improve our executive functioning, and help develop our capacity to pay attention, our capacity to expand our working memory. And of course, rest and reflection breaks. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of teenagers, especially getting 8 hours of sleep. If your kid, and about 50% of kids are doing this, has their cell phone in the room, the research suggests that kids are getting up about 3 times a night to check their phone. Well, you don't have to be a neuropsychologist to know that that's interrupting their sleep cycles. Sleep is absolutely critical for learning. If our sleep is interrupted, our brains don't consolidate the information we learn during the day, and then everything becomes a task with much more limbic friction than it would have had if we had just slept well. Anxiety and depression, as I mentioned, these senses of how good the world is, how well we are situated in it, how well we can solve our own problems. Anxiety and depression are often these silent stealth factors that are depleting kids' motivation. And oftentimes, particularly our boys, don't tell us things like, I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling depressed. What they've often learned is, when you're depressed or anxious, get angry. Our girls will often talk about it more, but generally a lot to their friends when they're teenagers. That is developmentally appropriate. But when we have a kid who's really struggling with motivation, one of our first hypotheses really does need to be, could this be a stealth anxiety and depression type of presentation? Anxiety takes up a lot of brain bandwidth. When you're anxious, you just don't have a lot of mental energy left to solve problems. What is emotionally salient to you is whatever it is you're worrying about or stressed about, not the schoolwork. So, depression also impacts how well we respond to rewards or the hope of rewards. Depression saps that dopamine and epinephrine and serotonin in our brain in ways that honestly we don't understand yet. But depressed people, one of the classic symptoms is that they don't get pleasure out of rewards or even thinking about rewards. And even when good things happen, a depressed person doesn't get much pleasure out of that. These things also cause fatigue because they interrupt sleep cycles and diminish the quality of our sleep. And so what do these mood disorders do? They sap concentration, they decrease persistence, and they increase avoidance behaviors. One strategy to think about is when you have a kid who's really wrestling with those automatic negative thoughts. I can't do this. I'm going to fail. I'm not smart. Everybody else is better than me. We can reframe that with tools like adopting the yet mindset. And this is from, I believe, Glenn Whitman or Ian Keller, or his co author. I forget which one of them came up with this. But instead of trying to like bribe our kids or cheer our kids up, sometimes it really helps to just acknowledge, like, yeah, this is really hard. And sometimes this sucks. And yeah, sometimes you really would rather be playing Overwatch than sitting and doing homework for 4 hours. I get that. You're not necessarily good at something yet, but it doesn't mean that you can't be. It just means it's hard to get there. And it's a really beautiful thing when we can acknowledge that for our kids. Again, we're not letting them off the hook and saying, like, oh, poor baby, poor you don't have to do anything. We're emphasizing that this is a process. We have to remember that kids do as well as they can. Remember, we want to take the focus when a kid is having motivation problems off the idea that these problems are all about the kid and that they're making conscious choices not to be successful or to engage in really unwise, self defeating behaviors. If kids have the skills and they have the self efficacy and the limbic friction is reduced and the cognitive load is manageable and they're not anxious and depressed, this is when they can succeed. So for us as adults, removing those barriers is the most important thing, but it really starts with shifting our mindset away from there's something wrong with this kid to how do we teach this kid what they need? How do we give them the fishing rod? How do we treat them? And how do we teach them what they need to be successful? We always have to consider when a kid is not succeeding that there could be a mismatch between the demands of the environment and what that child can actually do. So, to sum this all up, sparking motivation in kids, rekindling that fire is all about removing barriers. And this is when you get your professional team in place. Your professional team can be anybody, it can be a coach, a tutor, a clergy person, an older mentor, a grandparent. Getting those strong relationships, getting your team. It shouldn't just be you arguing with your kid at midnight over why they aren't done with their term paper yet. So, removing barriers is where we want to put our mental energy. And first, we have to have physical and mental health. If the physical health is lacking, if your kid is a couch potato who's sitting around on their phone for 6 hours a day, not getting out in the sunshine, not working out, chances are they're not very motivated. Treating untreated mental health problems, absolutely critical. You will not make progress with even the world's most fantastic tutor if that kid is struggling with the cognitive load of an anxiety or depression disorder. Again, strengthening those relationships. A lot of people came out of the pandemic with their relationships with their children very strained, and their kids lost the relationships that they had had with their teachers and their peers and their coaches, and their drama teacher, and all of these great adults whose relationship with them provided the motivation for these kids to overcome their limbic friction. We have to teach foundational skills. If your kids were like mine, they lost some ground during the pandemic. And my kids were pretty lucky because the pandemic hit them in fifth and eighth grades when they had already gotten a lot of their foundational academic skills. Like they could already read, they already had their basic math facts, they knew how to write an essay. But if the pandemic hit your kid at third grade or younger, your kid is probably lacking some of those foundational skills that we take for granted. And so this is when bringing in a tutor, getting in that extra help at school is what you absolutely need to do so that they have that fishing rod, right, that they need to be successful. Of course, we want to try to increase the salience, making things fun, having our kids actively engaged, giving them some choice. A lot of schools do a really good job with this. Some of the independent schools are very like kid friendly and focused in being like responsive classrooms. If your school isn't doing much to increase salience, if they're just all about like worksheets and tons of homework, and just sort of saying to your kids, well, you just have to do this because this is what you have to do. This is a good time to join the PTA. I mean, I know it sucks, but join the PTA, volunteer, get involved. We don't have to accept things as they are because this is the way that we've always done it. The pandemic's actually given us a great opportunity as parents to get more involved and think about, do we actually want to teach our kids with endless worksheets and sitting on their backsides and just passively taking in information and following the it's because I said so. Yes, you have to learn this just because. And of course, when you have a kid who is really stuck and you're stuck and things just don't seem to be getting better, that kid doesn't seem to be bouncing back, please don't wait to get the professional help. It is not only less time consuming, but to be perfectly blunt, it is cheaper if you get the professional team in. Again, whoever that is, get that professional team in sooner when the problem is smaller. You don't want to wait until your child is in a really bad headspace and they've started to have those automatic negative thoughts. I can't do this. I'm not smart. This sucks. I hate school. When once those automatic negative thoughts and the self have sorry, once the automatic negative thoughts have set in and self-efficacy goes way down, that belief that you could actually work hard and make a difference and achieve goals, once those things are suffering, it's a really hard problem to fix. And as you know, time and the curriculum march on very fast. A kid who loses a little bit of ground can fall behind very quickly. Don't make the mistake of waiting for a little problem to spiral into a big problem before you consult with somebody, before you get a tutor, before you get a coach. And if you don't have the means to do that, you'll find that in the schools, there's actually a lot of untapped resources you might not know about. A lot of teachers are providing kids with extra help during lunch. A lot of schools have Saturday programs, free online tutoring, and don't underestimate your guidance counselor. In the district, sorry, not just the district, in the DC metro area, particularly in like Montgomery County and Fairfax County, we have guidance counselors who are nationally certified mental health practitioners. They're free. They're there to help. So you don't always have to go out of network and out of pocket to find, sorry, out of pocket means a different thing now, doesn't it? And pay out of pocket to access professionals who can help. There's a lot of people who you can tap into for free in your kid's school, but it won't happen unless you advocate for it and you ask. Don't be afraid to do that. Again, talk to the people in your PTA, talk to your kid's guidance counselor, tap into those resources. And if the people at school aren't listening to you, make your posse, build your support team. That is what you need to do sooner rather than later to get your kids' motivation back on track. So thank you very much for having me. I believe I ended right on time. I hope so. It's my executive functioning feat of the day. So thank you very much for having me, and I'm happy to hang out for 10 minutes and answer any questions.
Wow, Dr. Resnick, that was really fascinating, and it was just chock full of information. I know I took a lot away. I'm going to
Probably too
move.
much.
No, no, no. I'm going to move to some questions. It's, a question really is where to start when you didn't intervene and your child's now in high school and who's refusing everything. Do you just maybe like, if you were to take in what you were saying, where do you think the best advice is of how to maybe practically speaking start in some of these areas?
Sure. The first thing I would say is don't beat yourself up about this. Things change very fast with kids. And if your kid is in high school now, the pandemic probably hit them in middle school or maybe even the very start of ninth grade. And this was the time when their brain was undergoing that big remodeling project and they really needed their friends and their teachers and all of those supports. And I don't know about you, but my kids went for about 18 months sitting in their rooms and they couldn't go back to school. So please don't think to yourself like, oh, this is all my fault. These things can spiral out of control very quickly. And it's very hard as a parent, to sort of know as it's happening, what should I do? It's easy to know, like, once the problem has become a big problem, like hindsight's 2020, like, oh, I should have done this, I should have done that. Well, yeah, but that's not your fault. You did the best you could, I'm sure, in the moment. And again, just please stop beating yourself up over that. So the very first thing is to tap into the school resources. I would make an appointment with the guidance counselor, maybe the administrator. You can refer your son or daughter or child to the school's multidisciplinary team. You talk to the guidance counselor, they will talk you through this and set up a meeting where everybody comes together and talks about how are we going to help this kid. This is part of the way that schools are supposed to operate. They do this all the time. And they will do it over the summer too, if you can't quite get that meeting to happen before the end of the school year. So talk to the guidance counselor, get a team meeting set up. They may call it a child study meeting. They may just call it a meeting. Whatever it is, you want all the important people there to talk about how do we turn the Titanic. And again, if you have the resources in your community to talk to people, try and build that posse. You might get a homework helper to come by in the afternoon, and that can be just like a community college student or a kind adult, or maybe even a slightly older high school student to just sort of be there to sit with your child and do homework. If you can access a really great tutoring and executive functioning coaching type of resource like Study Pro, where your kid can do their homework in the same room with a whole bunch of other kids, that positive peer pressure and get support, that's a really great avenue. What you don't want to do is try and solve the problem all by yourself, because then you wind up being upset and spinning your wheels, and it can really damage the relationship between you and your child.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, there's a couple other questions that came in. Um, I'm going to start with a general question, and this came from Chris, and I'm not going to skip over Iman's question. I'll answer that, ask that too. But I think generally, one of the things that we hear a lot, and I'm sure you may too, is that there is resistance for kids to getting support.
Yeah.
I have said often to people, the number one objection is that it's not that parents don't want to come to the homework center or to coaching or maybe to therapy. It's that the kids are resisting because they think if they get that support, that means they're broken or they're damaged or there's something wrong with them. So what advice do you have to get kids to open up more for some kind of support?
Yeah. And again, if I totally get that. I've raised 3 boys. And yeah, especially middle school or to like those early high school years, independence is so important to them. They don't want to hear there's something wrong, you need tutoring. It's embarrassing and humiliating. And they also have a really hard time like believing that it could make a difference. Plus, at that age, they want to goof off after school. For a lot of these kids who are having learning troubles, school is absolutely exhausting, especially if they're anxious or depressed. They spend most of their day in that sort of low meaning and low salience quadrant of the grid. And by the time they come home, they're pretty tapped out. And the last thing they want to hear is, hey, you screwed up so much. Now we need to hire a professional to deal with you. I mean, that's the message that kids often take from tutoring. So yeah, they don't want to go. And kids often, initially say like they don't want to come to therapy either. But once we get them in there and they actually start to taste a little bit of success and kind of start to bond with a really good therapist or tutor or coach, they often change their tune. And again, it's really important that there be like a personality fit. You don't want to have the tutor who ignores the importance of the relationship. Starting them off with like a homework center, like they have at Study Pro, like Fusion Academy, for example, has like a homework cafe where all the kids do their homework together. It's really important for them to see that the other kids getting homework support are not like losers, that they're also like bright, interesting people who probably, yeah, would rather be somewhere else, but they're getting what they need out of that process. telling a kid that they can choose between two tutors sometimes will be enough to get them over the resistance of being willing to go. Sometimes
Mhm.
you really do need to say to a child, like, yeah, I get it. Nobody wants to go to tutoring. I totally understand that. Um, but I think that let's at least try it. And
Mhm.
often the kid will be like, fine, because, part of them knows that they need it. And so if you can just get them in the door a couple times, and if the tutor has like a personality that's really engaging and they can spark a little bit of hope in that child that I can actually help and things can get better. And you might even spend this time having a good time. Like we can laugh about this and I'll become a mentor to you. That's often like really what they need to push past that.
Mhm. And I love what you said about giving them choice and about the we in it. We love you and we want for you to have every opportunity that you can to make this easier. And maybe even using some of what we've heard about the emotional assailants and the limbic friction and the load that we know that's happening and showing that empathy and making sure that they understand that. I think you're everything you've said today, I think, is so helpful. Um,
Yeah,
and
it's really hard for us parents to sort of cast our minds back to what a drag a lot of the school experience was. We often remember things like prom or, being in the play or playing on the football team or doing yearbook or whatever. But, if you just sort of think back to how much time you spent wishing you were somewhere else, it's easier to empathize with your child if you think about that. And part of it too is that your kid is seeing you as you are today. For most of us, we are, professionally kind of at the top of our game in this stage of our lives. Maybe things are we seem to know how to do a lot of stuff. And that's just because we've lived a long time. It's not necessarily because we haven't made a lot of mistakes or had to work really hard and push through our own embarrassment and limbic friction. But our kids, they don't really empathize with us very deeply because they're just kids. They don't really understand that. And so
mhm,
sometimes being vulnerable to them and sort of sharing, not like, well, I know because everything was exactly the same when I was your age, obviously not. It was for me, it was the 90s, very different time, but empathizing with the feelings of what it's like to be young and not to have any control over how you spend your time, that piece we can really connect with.
absolutely. And there was some questions about resources, and so maybe you can even send those to me, and I'll include them in
Okay.
the replay. But there's questions about where do I learn more about motivational research? Are there scientific journals or an academic center or lab? Appreciating advice, and then to follow up on that, so you can kind of make a note on that. That there was, you know, additional post to additional um, resources for parents who are neurodiverse.
Hmm.
Um, and another one was also asking about some other, and I can follow up with you on this in terms of other resources that, um, again, for parents. So I'll kind of follow you, but I just want everyone to know that we'll send anything that Dr. Resnick provides in
Yeah, I
terms
can.
of follow up.
Yeah, I mean, I've been. uh, Oh, and hi, Terry Bullis. I've been like reading about this and thinking about this, ever since I got my special ed degree back in '96, when, I came out of school with all these great fancy tricks and, all this science, that I had learned. And a lot of it just really didn't work, particularly whole language, but that's a whole nother topic. Um, and yeah, it's been a real journey and a real learning process because there aren't really simple answers. If there were simple answers, Debbie and I wouldn't have a job. It would just
Mhm.
be like, get this workbook and problem solved for 1999. But yes, I'll be happy to suggest some really practical, useful books. Importantly, ones that are based on good science and not just sort of somebody deciding like, hey, I have all the answers. I'm gonna write a book. Because I'm pretty fussy about my parenting resources.
Well, we really appreciate that and the fact that you can pass those on to us. And I know it's 10 o'clock, and I'm sorry, I know there was a couple other questions, but I did want to thank you so much. I mean, the other thing to dig into, of course, is to understand what's the need behind that behavior. And you really did share a lot of that.
Exactly.
Is it the anxiety and depression? Is it the emotional salience or the limbic friction? Is it, and even understanding more about different executive functions, because those are often really the challenge. And so we'll share a lot of the resources that we have, just a quick guide to executive functions and everything that I get from you, Dr. Resnik. So I just can't thank you enough.
Oh, my pleasure. This was fun.
The messages were flying in about how much people enjoyed this, and we're definitely, I hope,
good. That's nice
going
to
to
hear.
have you back. And we're very, very grateful for the time that you spend in preparing for this and delivering this today. So thank you so much. And thanks to the wonderful audience for all the great questions.
Yay. Yeah, thank you, everybody. It was nice to be here.
Okay, well, have a great day, everyone. Appreciate
All
it.
right,
Have a great
you too,
weekend.
everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.